Good morning and welcome to our breakout session on ensuring equity in emergency response. A quick housekeeping tip, we will be paying attention to chat for the Q&A, and that will be the theme of this session. It will be a mix of presentations and hopefully great interactions from you in the audience. I'd like to start by introducing myself. My name is Monica Sanders. I am the director of the William Averette Anderson Fund, or Bill Anderson Fund. It's an organization whose mission is to increase the number of underrepresented populations in disaster management and disaster science. I also teach law at the Georgetown Law Center, specializing in disaster law and how law and policy can help those same groups of people that we're going to be talking about today, as well as being an associate professor of sociology and criminal justice at the University of Delaware. So a big conversation about how society, as well as emergency managers, should be helping vulnerable groups. And now to give us another point of view in his own introduction is Dr. John Cooper of Texas A&M University.
Hi, I'm John Cooper, Assistant Vice President for Public Partnership and Outreach at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. I'm also a professor of the practice in the Department of Landscape Architecture and Urban Planning, and director of the Texas Target Communities Program, which provides technical assistance to small towns, mostly on planning and development matters. For this conversation, you should also know that I have experience as a professional emergency manager also. I spent a few years with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. And my research and practice focuses on increasing inclusiveness and equity and planning. And I look forward to the conversation. I'm also a founding board member of the Bill Anderson Fund. Thank you.
Smart. And then joining us from Rice University, Dr. Abraham, so nice to see you this morning.
Oh, great. Yes. Thank you, everyone who is also joining us out there. I'm David Abraham, and I'm teaching sustainability reporting and planning from the Professional Science Master's Program at Rice University. In addition to that, I do research on sustainability performance metrics. And as everybody is doing these days, focusing on equity. And of course, sustainability has always been about equity, but today we have to put that on the forefront to ensure that we are getting towards more balance among the pillars. In addition, I volunteer as well as on the City of Houston's Planning Commission. And in my role there, I get to support the development and growth in the City of Houston. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. All right, so getting into our presentations, I didn't do slides because I'm really looking forward to a conversation, but I want to think through or talk through some of the themes that we heard in the keynote this morning about disproportionate impacts on communities of color, and also the disproportionate or almost inept nature of the pandemic response while we're having other cascading events. I failed to say that I teach hazard economics, and I just want to put something out there for the audience to understand. When we say disproportionate amount of death rates, when we say it in 2 times the rate of whites, or 3.5 times the rate of whites, I don't think we fully comprehend how many people we've lost. Black and Latinx populations together represent 84 million Americans. In the last 4 months, 49,000 of them have died of COVID-19. We have removed 49,000 presumably productive adults from our economy and from our society in just under 4 months. So when we say disproportionate impact, and then we pair it with the rhetoric of emergency response, when we say whole community or whole of community response, the inequity really rings true. Because when you lose that subsection of a community in that short of amount of time, the long-term resilience impacts, the impacts on our economy, the impacts on our ability to restructure as a whole community will be severely disabled by that number of people and counting, because people, if we're not stopping to reach record rates, we probably have not reached the peak of this yet, will have a severe impact on our future. So I wanted to make a point about disparate impacts, but also thinking through, when we say emergency response, we can't decouple it from mitigation and from planning and from understanding that decisions we make or are not making right now will have an impact on us in the future. The next thing I wanted to point out in terms of this on this topic of cascading impacts, the Navajo Nation fires are burning right now, 10,000 acres and counting. It's still a hot spot for COVID-19, and we still haven't addressed the fact that 40% or more people in that population don't have access to running water, which, as we know, is a necessary part of fighting this pandemic based on what we know of it. The protests over civil unrest have not stopped happening. 12 hours ago, 100 people were arrested in Louisville, Kentucky, protesting for Breonna Taylor's murderers to be brought to justice. So as we take this in piecemeal and we only look at one thing at a time, we're disaggregating ourselves from the fact that we are dealing with multiple events happening at one time to multiple populations in disparate numbers. And this is why we focus on so-called frontline communities, Black, Indigenous, and Native American communities, and Latinx communities, excuse me, is because of the way these events cascade and intersect, and not only reveal, but exacerbate historical racism and oppression issues that cause those communities to be more vulnerable. In highlighting all of this, I want to make the point that it's time for us to reframe the concept of response. It's not written down anywhere, but the way that we do it is serving as many people as we can, as quickly as we can. It tends to be race blind, it tends to be poverty blind. We haven't addressed the fact that different communities need different standards of care. That the speed at which we deliver certain resources to different communities needs to be different based on what we know about historical context and the way that they experience these events, whether we're talking about a pandemic, a wildfire, or something else. I put together a piece last night about Black women and equity in COVID-19. If we look at just that group, we're looking at a group of people who are 54% more likely to be frontline workers than any other group. When you have a number like that and you don't take it and contextualize it and operationalize it, you're not going to get the appropriate response that yields the kind of outcomes that make communities more resilient. Under the question of, if we know this about African American women, and as Rita Carrion pointed out in the keynote this morning, Latinx women are right behind them. The percentages are just by 2 or 3%. If we know this about these two groups of women, why aren't we tailoring things like childcare, access to healthcare, access to testing towards the needs of these two groups first, since they are the most likely to be impacted by it? So I want to leave it there. I know we'll have plenty of opportunity to talk more about practical responses and true concrete things that we need to do in terms of response and recovery and mitigation, all of those things. But then I wanted to yield to my colleague, Dr. Cooper, to put his presentation, his idea out onto the floor.
You know, as I listen to you talk, I'm reminded too that we're coming up on the 15-year anniversary of Hurricane Katrina, and a lot of the issues that you lay out there. You know, if I want to draw another parallel to the COVID-19 situation, I describe some of those conditions as comorbidities that make certain populations more vulnerable to disasters than others, and we knew about this phenomenon long before Hurricane Katrina. And yet we have still haven't figured out how to get a handle on it. And when I'm talking about comorbidities, and in this case, it's people concentrated in high-risk areas in housing that's less able to withstand extreme events. These are the people who are least able to prepare for disasters in terms of stockpiling resources that help them get through the onslaught of a disaster. They are hit the hardest. They have the hardest time in recovery, if they recover, and yet we are still kind of struggling to figure that out. In my own research and practice, one of the things I try to deal with is the level of competency on behalf of the people that I teach and train on the issue of inclusion and understanding context and how to deal with the conditions and concerns and capacities of specific populations, those that tend to suffer disproportionately due to disasters. And so these are the kinds of strategies and ideas that I want to draw attention to and make people aware of, give them ideas for how they can deal with that kind of stuff. You know, I don't want to. I know Dr. Abraham talks a lot about how to put vulnerability in context. And so I don't want to step on what he says. I think I want to step back and maybe jump back in when it comes to to talk about where do we go from here once we understand the context.
Absolutely. And I have to confess, I too am excited to hear Dr. Abraham's thoughts about how we bring equity into some of these conversations and about measuring it as well. So please, sir.
Yeah, sure. And since it's a conversation and we're all in academia, I'm sure that we all have what to discuss around this sense of how should we be integrating, right? So following the trend of contextualizing our discussion, I'd like to point out also that this is 50 years since 2020 is 50 years since we initiated NEPA in this country, the National Environmental Policy Act. And this act, a part of its definition is the idea that we need to understand the effects of human, natural, and social environments, right? So it's known as the Environmental Charter, but and this thing went through Congress, by the way, and it was approved unanimously, right? Part of the charter recognizes that in protecting the environment, we're also talking about human environments, and projects today, major federal projects, have to abide by NEPA regulations, which call for an environmental impact assessment. And that environmental impact assessment has to include the impact on populations. Following that NEPA Act that was implemented in 1970, we had in 1986 the Community Right to Know Act. And the Community Right to Know Act is the preeminent act that calls for communities to have a planning process so that they can understand the impacts of chemical hazards in their neighborhoods or passing through their neighborhoods. And they should establish plans to respond to the event of a hazard. This is 1986, folks, okay? I would be remiss if I didn't go back to the 1970 NEPA Act and say that part of having an environmental impact assessment from the US, we have the most thorough and copied environmental impact assessment process in the entire world. And it's coming out of, again, this sense of understanding major impacts from projects. Countries all around the world copy us. So we are leaders in that area. Many of us would not be familiar with that, but we are leaders in that area with regards to the laws. Then in 1987, the international community came up with this universal mantra called sustainable development. I consider myself a sustainable development expert, and it thoroughly serves as an umbrella for all of my work. And the definition for sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability for future generations to meet their own needs. So the first word in this definition is development, right? We're not talking about something that's just for human beings. We're talking about development in all of its forms, including technology and infrastructure. But that has to meet the needs of the people who live in our world. And this is the real disconnect here, right? Where today we have much of development being represented by engineers and the banking community. And so really a lot of people say it's kind of, we are looking at engineering and technology when we talk about development. And then the human and the social component, which really should be a balance and should be the purpose of all this development, takes backseat. So I'd like to stop there with regards to my introduction to just lay the foundation for the fact that we started, the US has the most profound, the most thorough review for environmental impacts. However, we have fallen prey to technology and infrastructure and engineering, basically leading things without regard for the people that these things should be catering to.
No, thank you, Dr. Abraham. I do appreciate that, and just want to, add in conversations like this when we're talking about law and policy, as well as operationalizing things, particularly to a community. I assume our audience is mixed of business people, because we're talking to the chamber and emergency managers as well as academics, is the challenge of, making these things clear to the people that actually have to execute them. So, NEPA, as you pointed out, I didn't realize it was the 50th anniversary this year. Such an important piece of legislation, but that we've seen at the operational level, which makes it difficult for attorneys, to bring cases, is that the concept of it is weakened in operations, as well as during different regulatory moves that we've seen throughout different administrations. Without, getting into what the current or other ones have done, we see waiving of NEPA review in different communities for the sake of expediting emergency response. We have seen Right to Know Act just being ignored at different points, or communities not really knowing how to leverage it for their benefit. So there's an issue of how does the federal government appropriately dispense this information to advocacy organizations that can help communities use it. And so what we're seeing right now is those things are playing in the backdrop. The lessons that we learned from Katrina are playing in the backdrop, as Dr. Cooper pointed out. Katrina is still, from an academic standpoint, the most documented disaster in US history. We have more data from Katrina than we have from any other event. So my very practical but somewhat frustrated question is, what did we do with all of that learning? And how did we deliver it to emergency responders and our corporate citizens in a way that they could actually use it to produce positive outcomes? So the next question I'd like to throw out for a conversation and for us to think through is, how do we operationalize equity? What does that mean to operationalize equity in emergency response, so that our response, as you pointed out, Dr. Abraham, is tailored to the best of what we want for our communities? Gentlemen.
So I'd like to, at this point now, start the conversation on this social vulnerability index, yes. Which really, this is really something that some researchers at the Center for Disease Control came up with back in 2011. And the idea was that we need to look at vulnerability. And vulnerability really is a multiplicity of things. It's not just that you're poor, or that you're Black, or that you have a criminal record. Really, they came up with 15 measures in 4 categories. I'll just go over the categories: socioeconomic status, household composition and disability, minority status and language, housing and transportation. And the idea was that if we could effectively, in applying the social vulnerability index to disaster management, what the CDC was basically saying is that we could reduce primarily human suffering, human beings. We're talking about human beings, right? We could reduce human suffering, but more specifically for, again, our audience, we could reduce the economic loss related to providing social services and public assistance after a disaster. That's a tremendous amount, and many foundations understand that when it comes to trying to put funding out and get it to individuals, that's probably the hardest thing in the world to do. Foundations fund organizations, and organizations try to reach people. So we have to get to that trickle down. So if we could prevent the disaster in the first place, it makes it more likely that our investments can be a little bit more efficient. So this index is out there, and in 2017, the Houston area and a lot of the Gulf Coast suffered tremendously also from Harvey. So we had Katrina back in 2001, was it?
2005, August 29, 2005.
That's right, Allison was 2001. And then we had Harvey in 2017, and we were inundated in our region. The following year, we passed a $2.5 billion bond. Today, that bond has been matched. And so in total, the County Flood Control Agency, Harris County Flood Control District, has $6.6 billion that they have leveraged, in addition, again, to all the private financing and the foundations in our region, putting money to strengthen organizations to get it out to people and projects. So there became a question with regards to prioritizing now. How are we going to spend this money, right? We know where the money is now. How do we spend it? How do we prioritize that? So a local nonprofit agency introduced this idea that can we at least consider integrating something on social vulnerability in addition to other metrics? And so they came up with the idea that we could probably use the social vulnerability index. Again, it's an index, which means there's a range of values, but yes, those areas that have the highest vulnerability would show up as priority on an index. Now, the final index that was agreed upon consisted of 8 different criteria, 8 different factors. Social vulnerability index was one of them. The social vulnerability index accounted for 20% of the overall range for the overall measure for a project. Still, many in our community were hopping mad that we were not being efficient, right? Engineering term, we were not being efficient and covering the biggest projects first. Our leadership was interested in putting money into people's pockets, or fixing poor areas rather than fixing the biggest projects first. So we had the vote to approve the index, this flood control prioritization framework that was passed in 2018, by the way. The vote came out exactly along party lines. Our commissioners court has 5 members, 3 of them are Democratic, Liberal, and 2 are Republican and Conservative. And it was 3-2 in favor of passing this index. So this is what we're dealing with today. Any researcher could quickly overlay the index with the range of projects and show, right, that 20%, only 20% of poor areas are actually going to be prioritized, whereas 80% are not, according to the old standard. So we still have issues. However, this is at least an attempt in our region to apply equity in an efficient standard for an engineering community to be able to help with adaptation in response to at least flooding. What are your thoughts? Have you seen this anywhere else?
I actually use this and lecture about it in my class, but you make a good point about engineers and being able to overlay the index however you would like to. You know, what about the social scientists? What about the CEOs? And what about some others? Before we get into that, I want to bring in the big issue that we just can't seem to get our hands wrapped around is what happens to the person who is in the field, in the middle of the catastrophe, trying to make good decisions in that moment, as well as ones that will impact our future. So I would love to draw on Dr. Cooper's practical experience, both as an emergency manager and as someone in the academy, to take us to this part of the conversation. And then, you know, I got some thoughts about being culturally competent, but I'm going to hold that because I want to hear from Dr. Cooper.
Yeah, there's a lot to respond to what Dr. Abraham said, and then to pinpoint to your question. I just sort of say that so we got the index in 2011, but as I was saying before, people who study disasters and work in disasters were well aware of the issues, long before 2011. That Dr. Abraham, you make this point, but before Harvey, there was Katrina. Before Katrina, there was Hurricane Floyd in 1999. Before Hurricane Floyd, there was Hurricane Andrew. Monica will take us all the way back to the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. And so these issues that have been out there, the Great Mississippi Flood, I invite people to Google the Great Mississippi Flood and read about some of the atrocities that were happening there. In my own research, I was trained on the assessment of plans created in response to guidelines laid out by NEPA and the community rating systems and other kind of federal policies. And, in my dissertation work, I was looking for the extent to which equity was accounted for in plans made in response to federal policies. And there was a lot to be desired there, right? And one of the things I concluded was that even when emergency managers, this sort of gets to your point, even when emergency managers believe in the efficacy of inclusive planning and accounting for diverse populations. It's not something they're comfortable doing, and not something they're trained to do. They're mostly, working in top-down command and control models. A lot of them are ex-military, still largely male, right? And when, to your point, Dr. Abraham, this kind of work is more of a humanitarian endeavor, right? So they need to be trained in how to work in different cultural contexts. They need to be, trained in, we need to have ways to build their knowledge and skills and, competency, work on their attitudes towards it. You will find in federal guidance calls for inclusion going back to the 70s, but professionally, it just hasn't sunk in. Some colleagues and I took some notes. Some colleagues and I did a study back in the late 2000s, around 2008, 2009, that polled professional emergency managers to find out what their attitudes were about inclusion and addressing equity issues. And many of them felt like if they were to invite the public to be more engaged in the process, that it would become dominated by special interests, as if it's not already. They didn't feel like it would guarantee representation, as if not working on guaranteed representation would lead to more representation. They felt like the general public would lack expertise, when in my experience, I found that lay people, when you give them access to information, they can make wise, savvy decisions, technical decisions, decisions that engineers make, right? They believe that engaging the public, if they were to do that and somehow the process fell apart, it would lead to distrust of public decision makers, as if there's not already distrust. Where in my experience, I found that when you engage the public, they tend to learn more about what you do. They're more empathetic. They're more likely to support you when the heat is on. And we know that emergency management is a thankless job, after the fact, when people start pointing fingers. And they said that, when they involve the public, it usually leads to some kind of delay. When in my experience, it might lead to some delays on the front end, but on the back end, it goes much faster, and you're much more likely to get public support when you engage public in figuring out what questions to ask, what data to gather, how to analyze that data, and what policies are most appropriate. So I don't know, Monica, if that's what you're getting at. But.
Yes. So
okay.
Thank you for that. And we do have a question coming in about how to apply NEPA to policy and disaster management plans, and I'll read that, but I want to respond both to the cultural competency issue as well as the social vulnerability issue. Whenever I hear an emergency manager say, when I engage the community, there's a delay, I said, because you and the community are communicating at two different wavelengths, because you don't understand the people with whom you are working. And so the delay is you facing the challenges of different communication styles, different cultural challenges, and the inability to receive the information that they are giving you in a way that you can effectively use it. To your point of the emergency management community is incredibly homogenous at this point. It has been for years. I think in one of my articles, I cited your work and a work of another Bill Anderson Fund ally, Dr. Ellis Stanley, discussing in this country, if we look at fire services, it's still something like 88% white male, according to Bureau of Labor Statistics. Whereas the context of this country, in most neighborhoods, particularly in most urban neighborhoods, the population is not 88% white male. Those are not going to be the people that you're receiving information from. And so when we're talking about how to make equity a part of emergency response, the first part of it is change the face of emergency response. And to those who ask the questions about it being taken over by special interest groups, or what does this mean for me? Look, rights are not an exhaustible set of resources. There's enough rights to go around for everyone. There's enough humanity and dignity for everyone. So you're not going to lose yours just because we bring other people into it. It's the first thing that naysayers need to understand. Including others does not automatically mean excluding you. But we need to change the face of it so that it matches our community. And in addition to making the hiring decisions and the leadership decisions that we have all, just like in our advocacy work, have been saying for decades, part of it is engaging the community and engaging corporate America. I've seen some great articles about how more effective and efficient and productive corporations are when they have diverse boards and diverse leadership structures. And we've seen corporate America start to shift in that way, even more intentionally in the current context. When you are working with the Walmarts, UPSs, the Home Depots, Google, all of these that want to have some disaster response capacity, not only should emergency managers be thinking about receiving the benefits of their financial support, but also engaging in some knowledge management and information exchange, because they are learning something about diversity and actually executing it that our community could benefit from. Engaging community organizations rather than shrugging your shoulders and being frustrated because the NAACP or Unidos or a women's organization is giving you this information that I just gave you about the numbers of Blacks and Latinx women who are disproportionately impacted by an event. Have them at the table during planning so you have those numbers when you're doing your planning, as opposed to hearing about it when the response is not to the taste of the community or to the best interest of the community. Some of this is reframing who's doing the response. The other piece of it is how we are doing it. If we have all this information about communities and engineers can take the SVI and overlap it with respect to infrastructure, GIS mapping teams, for those of you in our audience, can take that same index and apply it to maps and tell you geographic locations in a community that align to certain vulnerabilities. What if we incorporated that information into how we do response and make decisions that instead of arbitrarily pre-positioning resources because of warehouse space, but pre-positioning resources because that's where the vulnerability and the most immediate need will lie in the event of an emergency, and we need to respond to it and we need to draw on those resources quickly. And making other policy decisions, which, I want to get into how it's structured around home ownership when we're talking about FEMA response as opposed to income, and we don't account for single heads of households and housing and food insecurity or some of those other things that impact equity at the response piece. But I do want to get to this question. Here's a question verbatim. NEPA and the Community Right to Know Act are consistently undermined by the engineers and technologists and the current administration as impediments to development, economic growth, recovery, et cetera. What suggestions or approaches do you have for integration of these statutes into the planning, disaster response, and other such plans?
I like what you raised, Dr. Cooper, a couple minutes back when you mentioned the training that our professionals have in our country. And I think part of the issue here is a legacy of training people in silos. The social scientists are on one side of campus, the natural sciences on one side of campus, and the engineers are on one side of campus. And so, if don't get me wrong, I love engineers. I love efficiencies, and I also believe in trying to get towards a science of managing an urban area. But we have to start with a comprehensive representation of what our areas, our urban areas are, or domains that we care about are. And the domains are, according to sustainability, social pillar, economic pillar, and environmental pillar. Companies know very well that the economic pillar is very important, and more companies are the leading international companies have adopted sustainable development and have started to do sustainability reports because they're recognizing, wait a minute, the environment is important because I have to get my resource stocks from somewhere. And the more I can use my waste rather than paying somebody to haul it off, the more of that I could use back into my process, the less my process will cost. So again, quantifying that. Here's the other piece to the point of really our topic on equity. How are my workers? Are my workers well? Will I be able to attract the best workers? And so things like where I'm going to locate my company, think Amazon, right? Think Silicon Valley, for instance. Where am I going to locate my company means I want to choose a city where the city has quality of life and affordability for my staff. The largest companies can do that very well. And so they are already, many companies are already integrating a sense of balance between the social, economic, and environmental. However, we're still training engineers without recognizing, without being able to help them to quantify human qualities. How do we quantify human qualities? How do we quantify environmental impact? Really, this is, if we could do that better in academia, I think we can also help, those folks out there who are just quite, engines of efficiency, those engineers that are engines of efficiency. Tell me what it is and I'll get it done, right? There's that part of things that we can handle in academia. Another part of things is, as you mentioned, political. A lot of it is political as well, and unfortunately, we're dealing with a cultural climate in our country where we're capitalists, right? We're not socialists. So on a part of it, we have to come to bear with, what does capitalism mean? Is capitalism pure capital, or is it also more should it be sustainable capitalism? Or what would sustainable capitalism look like? Right? None of us are saying that we should be communists or socialists. What we're saying is that what we need to do is to find ways in which to make the process more efficient and more comprehensive with regards to covering, again, these three pillars: the people, the money, and the environment in which we operate.
Dr. Cooper?
I'll just say, I think in response to the question, I want to endorse something you said about the need to reimagine policy policy levers and incentives, make it a part of kind of everyday practice. The other thing is until that happens, I think I, as a practitioner, do the best I can to try to work around the guidelines to do things the right way and frame it so that it meets the guidelines. I'm not sure if that gets to the question, but yeah.
Yeah, and also to put this in is just to underscore in direct response to the question from the perspective of, I worked on Capitol Hill on both the House and Senate Homeland Committee with oversight over the emergency response agencies. And so this question about how do we put it into policy and planning, really, to our dear audience member, a lot of this again is about communication, because the whole concept that NEPA should be a part of emergency management was reinforced in the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. So we have law and policy that already says that. We adjusted our emergency support functions in FEMA to bring in environmental issues, cultural resources, even though we're talking about places and things and not people, but I know that there's some equity guidebooks coming out to sort of transition that to thinking about people as well when we're talking about cultural heritage. So it really is, the federal government and these guidelines sit up here at the 10,000 foot level, right? And what we're trying to do in this conversation is bring this down to, hey, that's great when we are in our political centers in Washington, D.C., talking about policy and politics, or in New York and other places from the economic or financial standpoint, or even, we need to acknowledge Silicon Valley, thinking about this, how we use technology. But how can we take that and make it have meaning to the person at the state and local level that needs to make decisions based on all of these policies and communicate it in a way that they can receive it? When I'm in class, and I'm sure you gentlemen say the same thing, it's like we want, for the sake of the academy, deep research, lots of collection of data and interviews and in-depth writing. And so the journal publications and that work is for us to better understand problems. But when we get to communicate the problem, I often encourage students, think about publishing in blogs, on The Conversation, on Medium and things like that, because I'm sure, when we were talking to Brooks Nelson from the Chamber Foundation, I said, would you rather read my 30-page article about NEPA or what have you, or would you rather read my 2-minute Medium blog about it? And he just laughed, because we know what the obvious choice is. So we need to get in the place of making these policies and all of these adjustments accessible to the people who need to use it most, right? Because my response days are over with. I'm supposed to teach people about how to do response, and I need to package things in talking points and in blogs and incorporate it into training. Because I'm sure there are people that, asked this question and said, look, we've been pushing NEPA as part of emergency management. Now, PCMRA was passed in 2006, a year after the event. So 19 years. and we still haven't effectively communicated that information so that it can be used in a response.
Yeah. You know, again, I suspect it has to do with this persistent problem we have with separate domains and not knowing how to do interdisciplinary work, right? NEPA is pretty much environmental, right? Environmental scientists are the ones doing NEPA, and engineers, of course. And then you have emergency management, which, you know, might be fire and ambulance, right? Primarily fire and ambulance. Ambulatory services, you know, and then you have sociology. So where do these things need to kind of be integrated in order for us to be able to merge the emergency response into the NEPA framework? NEPA is a process, so it's not that we can't do it; it's that we need somebody to push it to make it happen. Because you could, you know, every year we get from the Council of Environmental Quality, we get different ways. The Council of Environmental Quality kind of acts, for those of you who are not familiar, they kind of act as the White House kind of body that governs NEPA in our country. The EPA is the primary agency. However, you also get each federal agency could be the lead on a potential project. So when it comes to hazards that might fall under the Army Corps of Engineers, somewhere between the Corps of Engineers and again FEMA, you could get them leading a project and asking CEQ for whether or not this project needs to meet the requirements of environmental impact assessments or not. I also teach a class in environmental impact assessments and NEPA. And I also ask the students to prepare, you know, Dr. Sanders, my approach is to prepare a trifold brochure, right? To explain this project and to be able to communicate it. And I've been pleasantly surprised, by the way. Many times I see a brochure for a fictitious project looking like something real. And it's scary, right? Oh, you know, a project might be, let's say we were to build a paper mill in the middle of campus, right? How would we properly analyze that? And so imagine putting that on a billboard, you know, the entire campus would jump. But yes, this is what happens when people know what's happening. Yes, there is the shock. Yes, there is the, okay, now I know what's happening. Now I can orient myself properly to respond. And many people don't know whose responsibility is it? Whose responsibility is it to, you know, we talk about the Community Right to Know Act. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that the community knows?
Yeah, and that's what we need to discern. And gentlemen, this is such a great conversation. We've got some more questions coming in. Dr. Cooper, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond, and then we'll move on to our next set of questions.
I just wanted to make a practical point for members of our audience who represent corporate social responsibility or corporate foundations, and that is in my experience of developing plans and evaluating plans, not only have I noticed that the public involvement is generally limited, but we've also learned that the goals are typically restorative, you know, wanting to build back, you know, to the status quo, rather than transformative, and that is trying to address some of the inequities that were in place before the you know, persistent systemic issues. And so another thing we learned is that planning lacks coordination with community-based organizations. So my suggestion is, if you're representing corporate philanthropy or any kind of you know, corporate social responsibility, I want to encourage folks to look for those community-based organizations that know the lay of the land, that represent the people, that will be there long after the disaster is over, rather than some of these other organizations. I mean, the Red Cross does great work, but first try to find a community-based organization to invest in.
Yeah, absolutely. And that happens both in the US context, and I know some of our business interests, you know, get involved in this as well as in the international context. It's great that you have large organizations with a lot of capacity that can deliver assistance, but then if you want the long-term impact and if you want to have good compliance, working with people who know the lay of the land is one of the most valuable things you could do. Staying with you and also Dr. Cooper, this is something that I don't know who wrote this, but this is so near and dear to my heart. Is there a disaster response framework that incorporates disparities in computer skills, access, Wi-Fi, and so forth, and disparities in access to capital in unbanked and underbanked communities? Not yet. And one of the things that we are discovering in this pandemic, and that some of my colleagues at the Internet Society and I have been thinking about and working on in communities, is connectivity. When we think about dead zones, we think about rural areas, which is important because staying with the theme of cultural competence, we know that Blacks and Latinos in rural areas are 3 times as likely to catch COVID-19, but they are also 3.5 times less likely to have appropriate connectivity to enjoy work from home opportunities and to educate their children. When we talk about deep urban areas, Black women are less likely than any other group to have consistent access to the digital economy, yet we know that they're more likely to be frontline workers. But also, Black women are the fastest growing entrepreneurs in the country. The numbers have risen by 164%, but they have the least amount of access to capital. Pause for a second and think about that in terms of community resilience. If we properly connected and properly banked these populations and communities, or expose them to different kinds of funding and increased economic and digital opportunities in communities. If we're dealing with something like a pandemic, because I don't mean to sound like, the professor of doom, we're gonna have another one where you're cut off because of the inability to travel or for transportation issues that happens in a so-called natural disaster, right? If people are able to work and connect from within their communities, they have more resilience and more ability to bounce back after the initial event happens, if they have that kind of sustainable access. So the answer to your question is there's not one, but there are people who are thinking about it and working on it. And I know from your point of view, working in communities, you have a lot of thoughts about this. So I want to go to you first, Dr. Cooper. And then after that, we have a question about state and locals. Just want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, I don't know if I could improve significantly on the response you gave. I think it was perfect. So I think I agree. Yeah, no, rural broadband is an issue. Connectivity is an issue across the board.
Yeah, Dr. Abraham?
The only small thing I would add as well, thank you, Cooper. You took the words out of my mouth. That was actually what I was going to say. But the only thing I would say is, that what the question is getting to is, again, what are all of those moving parts that could be integrated in this, in being able to quantify disaster response? And in many cases, all of these tools, when we talk about access and connectivity, we have to think about different ways and different, not just ways of access, but different redundancies in the engineering to supply those things. And for example, Centerpoint, who provides a lot of the infrastructure for our electricity connectivity in the Houston region, Centerpoint relies on overhead power lines. Many cities are looking to bury power lines because it adds to more scenic driving routes rather than seeing unsightly power lines. However, Centerpoint has decided that they can't do that because we have flooding here. And now, while that's so we're keeping overhead power lines because of the practicality here. Here's the other thing, specifically with the types of hazards that might come. Centerpoint is more worried about storms than they are about flooding for the same reason. Storms will pull their power lines down and flooding will not. So we quickly got power back after Harvey, which was unprecedented flooding. But however, when it comes to storms, then it's not. So when we think about connectivity, I was just saying it's not so simple with regards to we just need to maintain access and give accessibility. I think the question, the major contribution that question has to what we're talking about is we have to understand, and we do have the tools to understand what are those moving parts that need to be considered and need to be part of our toolbox so that we could be ready to deploy them in the eventuality that we need to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that and for bringing that into bear. Here's a question. What can be done to give state and local agencies more flexibility in using emergency response funding so that it can be used more effectively at the local level? I know from working on oversight and budgets at the federal level, the hazard mitigation grant program is really important to state and local agencies. Community development block grants are really important, but they come with a lot of restrictions that, again, some of when we're talking about NEPA and some other laws, we get into different political situations and we decide to make them more or less flexible. So for me, it's taking the programs that we already know exist and could be effective and efficient for communities and making them consistently effective and efficient for communities, as opposed to having the requirements ebb and flow with whomever is in charge. Because that's a lot. Just again, thinking pragmatically, if you're a state and local emergency manager, you're not just hanging out waiting for the next catastrophic event with a federal declaration. You have other things to do than to try to keep up with how and when and what you can do with federal grant funds and with federal assistance. And so bringing some consistency, and again, this cross-training and communication theme comes up, is making sure that the tool isn't just written down in a way that makes sense, but that you actually know how to use the tool. So when the day comes, you know exactly what to do without having to interrupt your process to deal with paperwork and red tape, or just a simple not understanding what's available to you. Again, that is the question. That's my very brief comments on it. Gentlemen, what could we be doing to make this easier for state and local agencies?
John?
Yeah, I'll just add to that. It sounds like the person, I would guess the person asking the question has a pretty good understanding of what's possible. In my experience, you know, I used to walk around with the Code of Federal Regulations, which offers guidelines on how money can be spent. And I found that there was a lot of flexibility there. My frustration was with how local governments were using the money on a lot of bells and whistles, right? And not so much on planning and inclusion. So I wish there was more of that. And I think there's lots of resources out there for that. In fact, I used to get frustrated going to, FEMA headquarters and asking for money, and they would turn me around and say, there's a lot of money still unspent. There's a lot of money left over from disaster declarations unspent. We still have a lot of money for Hurricane Harvey unspent in Texas. And so more money gets wasted in actuality. That's not to say that, people like the person who asked me the question, I'm imagining that person is an innovative thinker and is looking for, and has exhausted all of the ways that are allowable currently to spend the money, is just looking for more. I applaud that person, but more often the case is people are wasting money.
Yeah, and I'm gonna look at that question and contextualize it, put it in the context of intergovernmental collaboration. I've been talking about interdisciplinary sharing for this entire talk, and I wanted to visit intergovernmental collaboration for a little bit. Florida is now leading the nation with the highest number of COVID infections. However, at the beginning of this thing, being at the beginning, around March or so, when the entire country was recognizing that we have to shut down, Florida actually was leading the country in managing the COVID. And when I looked at data comparing different states, different regions, I found that Florida stood out with regards to, yes, having a big impact initially, but then being able to control it. And so what are those things that would allow Florida to be able to control? Well, Florida has a history of having to respond to natural hazards every single year, right? So they have an amazing structure in place for government body collaboration and stakeholder engagement. Governmental departments there talk to each other. They know how to work with each other. And so that allowed them to be able to control things there. The fact that they're not controlling it now, then obviously cannot be because the infrastructure isn't there. The infrastructure is there. There's something else going on in Florida right now, and we don't really want to get into politics, in this particular session. But I'd like to say that government collaboration is very important. When a potential funder invests in an institution, I'm sure that they don't think about, well, I'm giving money to the housing department right now of the city of Houston, or I'm giving money to the Department of Sociology at Rice University. No, they say, we gave money to Rice University. We gave money to the city of Houston. And we all know, if any of us that have sat through a city council or a Senate committee, or we see individual members bringing a presentation of what they received. And so partially that's the problem. That's why we can't get this money drawn down or spent, because we don't have proper collaborative, the cities that do better with inter-body collaborations are, which is more efficient, by the way, again, to pin something for the engineers here. We don't want to be too negative on engineers. The cities that are more efficient are the cities that will be able to respond better, will be able to draw down those fundings. And the ones that are not are those cities that do not have the history or have not been able to get their different directors to collaborate properly to go after funding. Just because it's a HUD fund doesn't mean that your Department of Public Works can't be a collaborator to get that HUD monies down into this community that needs infrastructure when it comes to roads, right? HUD is supposed to be the Housing and Community Development Department. And over time, we forgot about the community development part, and we focused on the housing part, right? So I think funders holding their funding sources accountable for being representative of an entire agency is one step towards, again, making sure that your monies and your investments are being used more efficiently.
No, thank you so much for that. And I know we're coming up to time, but I also know that one of the things, and there's been lots of them, and I'm so grateful for this conversation, that we promised would be a takeaway is that we would offer up some practical ideas about what could be done to increase equity in disaster response. So I just like us to close by each offering one or two things that we think could be done now or in the short-term future to improve equity and response. And obviously, I'm thinking a lot about this one, and we've been talking about connectivity and digital divide and different things about opportunities. Knowing what we know about the potential for school to start or not start or be online in the fall because of the pandemic, we often don't think about children in emergency response. And I know that's a whole other panel that I'd love to have one day. But the concept of making sure that appropriate educational support tools, appropriate childcare tools and vouchers and payments for low socioeconomic families, I think is something that HHS, FEMA, as well as our corporate partners could be thinking about. Like, are there childcare vouchers? Can we have a program where we can write off the additional cost of internet access for low-income families, as opposed to it just for being people who telework or have home offices and that sort of thing? What if low-income families impacted by this pandemic could write it off or receive a credit to ensure that they have consistent internet access to be able to educate their children and stay safe at home during this pandemic? And what could corporate America be doing? Because I know there's Facebook education, there's Google education evangelists all out there that think about this. So how can they partner with the federal and state and local governments to help improve security for these families as we continue to go through this pandemic? And that's my thought, and I would love to go to you, Dr. Cooper, and then Dr. Abraham before we round this out.
I'll just circle back to a point I made earlier. I think for corporate foundations, I encourage them to invest in building and sustaining the capacity of community-based organizations. I'd also add that I believe, as a professional planner, planning is key. Planning matters. I think when you have a thoughtful plan developed in an inclusive way, procedural equity, if you will, that you're much better coordinated when the moment comes. And it's much better to access money because you can say, here's what we plan to do with it, right? And so planning matters.
And I'd like to add to that. I'm in agreement, by the way, wholeheartedly with my co-presenters here. And I'd like to add that one thing we're increasingly realizing is that in addition to having a plan, we also need to integrate performance measurement and evaluation in addition to the plan. And this helps plans from not being just dust on a shelf if you have an ongoing evaluation component. Most businesses, most of the corporate world already know that performance measurement and evaluation is important. but how do you apply metrics to, again, cover the human dimensions in addition to the economic dimensions? And the other part is the environmental dimension. To do that, you have to collaborate with subject specialists in those areas. And so having that interdisciplinary team and forcing your stakeholders to do the interdisciplinary team is also, I think, prudent. And really, this leads to more efficient public-private partnerships, which is I think the theme for this week of events. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you both. Thank you to the Chamber for having us. Thank all of you who have attended and listened to us this last hour. It's been a wonderful conversation. I hope you got a lot from it. And all of us have our information in the speaker agenda if you have further questions, or you can contact the organizers, and we're happy to respond to any further comments or questions. With that, I know there's an amazing lineup this afternoon and you're up against a break. So we're going to say goodbye and thank you. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.